Our remarks today are going to be focused on a very simple idea. And the idea is that leaders can be multipliers. That in their role as leaders and what they do as a leader, they can make people more capable, more productive, and we would venture to say smarter. They can actually be multipliers. I want to start with a very simple question. What is the fate of the smart and the talented? What do we do with our smartest, most talented, most capable people inside organizations? What do we do with them? Louder. We give them more work. What do we do with the smartest and the most talented people inside organizations? Quite often, organizations promote them, and they promote them into management. But the problem is that many of these leaders have spent years being reinforced for their own ideas, their own intelligence, their own capability. And sometimes these leaders don't look beyond their own capability to really see and use the genius that sits on their team. Leaders who don't make this transition can end up draining intelligence and capability from people around them, and they can actually become what we call diminishers of talent and capability. Now, through our research, we have seen a different model of leadership. We've seen a model where leaders use their smarts and their intellect to amplify the intelligence of people around them. And we call these leaders multipliers. And what you're going to see today is what our research showed, that these leaders don't get a little bit more from the people they work with. They get vastly more. In fact, they get up to twice the capability from people around them. As Greg and I are sharing our thoughts with you today, I'd like you to do a couple things. I'd like you to think about a leader that you've worked with, someone around whom you were brilliant, you were capable, you did your best work, you solved hard, complex problems. And then think about another leader around whom you struggled to do tough things, someone that made you question your own intelligence. Maybe around someone that you ended up holding back. You couldn't give your full capability. I'd also like you to think about your own tendencies as a leader. I'd like you to think, are you a multiplier? Someone who uses their intelligence to amplify the intelligence of others? Or are you like many of us, who maybe have a little bit of diminisher in you? And I'd like you to think about that as we go through our remarks. First, let me introduce you to some of these leaders that we studied. We did a global research project over 2 years, and these are some of the leaders that we encountered. Lutz Ziob, general manager of Microsoft Learning. His people say of Lutz, Lutz creates an environment where good things happen. He hires great people, he allows them to make mistakes, and he ferociously debates the most important decisions with his management team and his whole organization. Sue Segal, former president of Affymetrix, whose partner says of Sue, she's now a venture capitalist at Moore David Howe Ventures. Her partner says of Sue, there's a Sue effect. Everyone around her grows and companies grow under her guidance. He says, I often wonder what people are like when they're not around Sue. Greg and I went to go interview her. We had this fabulous interview. We walked out of the parking lot like, oh, that was a great question. Oh, that was funny. You were funny. We were so smart. And then we're like, oh, that wasn't really us, you know. She was smart, and we felt brilliant around Sue. We kind of joked that we got sued. But there is this Sue effect that people are at their best around Sue Segal. Narayana Murthy, former CEO, former chairman of the board of Infosys, one of the jewels of India, who built a $5 billion company, 100,000 people strong, and he built it on the idea of hiring really smart people, smarter than himself, and building a management team that could succeed him. He turned the reins over to Nandan Nilekani years before it was time for him to step down. And then Nandan Nilekani did the same thing, turning the reins over to someone else, with that organization continuing and not skipping a beat. K.R. Sridhar, CEO of Bloom Energy, the innovators of the Bloom box, which has gotten a lot of media attention lately, and I guess there are probably a rack of Bloom boxes here on this campus. It's a green tech firm that builds a clean fuel source. KR is a brilliant scientist himself. In fact, he literally is a former NASA rocket scientist. But what he does is he creates an environment where people can experiment. And he creates an environment of a lot of pressure, but absolutely no stress. How do you create an environment with lots of pressure, but no stress? How would you do that? Lots of pressure, no stress. He holds people absolutely accountable for running the experiments. Run the experiments, test the science, but he doesn't hold them accountable for the outcome. And lastly, Bill Campbell. Bill Campbell, who is well known as the former CEO of Intuit, a fellow who's a former Columbia football coach turned business executive, who's not a technologist but has a reputation for working well with technologists, because in his words, they have a genius that I don't have. He sees that genius, he admires that genius, and he's able to bring out that intelligence and use it inside the organization. But maybe not so well known as the former CEO of Intuit, he has become the coach to some of Silicon Valley's top executives. Steve Jobs at Apple, Eric Schmidt here at Google, and many others at Google and other companies. We're going to talk a little bit more about Bill later. We discovered these multipliers, these people, as Greg and I embarked on a research journey that started in a very simple observation. It was an observation based on my 17 years at Oracle, where I ran the corporate university and got to work with the top executive team. And Oracle was known for hiring really, really smart people. And I looked out at this executive team, and they were all brilliant. It's one thing they all had in common. But they didn't all bring out brilliance in people around them. I noticed that some of these leaders didn't have what you might consider to be viral or contagious intelligence. They were brilliant, but no one else around them got to be so smart. They had a way of dumbing down people around them. Yet other leaders amplified the intelligence of others. And I asked this question, why are we geniuses around some, but not around others? As we looked at these two types of leaders, Greg and I were determined to find out why. I was out coaching a number of executives in Silicon Valley, and I saw this pattern again and again, and we wanted to know why. Why do some leaders amplify intelligence and others drain it? Over the course of 2 years, we studied 150 leaders in 35 different companies all across 4 continents trying to answer this question. In pursuit of that, people told us their stories. They told us about people they worked with around whom they were smart. They did their very best work. And they told us about people that they had worked with where they shut down and they became incapable. One of these stories that caught my attention was told to me by one of my clients, now a CEO of an internet startup. But he told this story about being 18 years old. I call this story a change in command. Started when he was 18 years old, living in Israel. And what do 18-year-olds in Israel do? They go into the military. So Gabi, like all of his peers, goes into the military. He goes into a boot camp program, and he is slated to go in and learn to be a tank commander. So he's going to go through the tank commander training program. He does 6 months of boot camp. He and 2 of his fellow soldiers do such a great job in boot camp that they're actually tapped on the shoulder and assigned to go out to real combat duty. So they're deployed up to the north. They've been training in the Golan Heights. They're sent up to help patrol this kind of questionable border between Israel and Lebanon. And they're going to be out in real combat conditions. In these combat conditions, with 6 months of boot camp training, Gabi does extraordinarily well. He navigates well. He operates the tank well. He works well with his fellow soldiers. He works well with his commanding officers. He handles the ambiguity and the complexity of the battlefield extraordinarily well. Well, after 3 months, they go back to Israel and they rejoin the group that's just now finished boot camp. They're now going to enter the tank commander training program and rejoin their peer group. But at the time they do that and they're sent down to the south of Israel, they experience a change in command. Now Gabi was going to be performing and learning under a new commanding officer whose name was Yuval. Now Yuval had to leave the Air Force for health reasons. He comes in, he's a quick study on tank operations. He's now a new commanding officer, but he seems like he has something to prove. And then specifically, he's got something to prove to Gabi. Gabi does well in the classroom, but every time he goes out into the field with Yuval at the command, he struggles. His team goes out to perform navigational exercises. They have to find waypoints and return those waypoints back. They start to struggle. Yuval points out all the mistakes, singles out this group's performance, and they go from being good navigators to suddenly they're now returning in the bottom 20%. Gabi does great in the classroom, but every time he gets in the tank with Yuval supervising him, he starts to struggle with things he had no problem doing out in combat. Now, it won't surprise you when you see how these tanks are set up. So you've got right here, right there, this is the tank commander. So that's where Gabi sits. This is the very unfortunate guy whose head is like, a foot out of the tank. There's a gunner and there's a navigator, and then seated right here, there's a steel chair bolted to the top of the tank. That's where the training officer sits with a clipboard on his thigh to take notes and document all of the mistakes that are made. So this guy Yuval is literally sitting 10 inches above his head. So for those of you who think you've had a boss who kind of has hovered over you, this is nothing. So you can feel this guy breathing down here. Well, Gabi starts to struggle. Every time he goes out in the tank with Yuval, in the chair, he can't operate. He starts to fail maneuvers. He doesn't just fail one, he fails 2 and 3. And quickly, Gabi is failing every one of his tank maneuvers. So Yuval goes to the company commander, whose name is Lior, and says, we have a soldier that needs to be dismissed from the tank commander training program. Well, this is a huge deal. This is the end of his military career. It's not a great way for a young man to get off to start of his career. But protocol necessitates that before he can be dismissed from the program, he needs to perform a single maneuver out in the field with the company commander, this young officer named Lior. Well, Gabi's friends are kind of wishing him luck on this very ill-fated task because they know he's probably going to fail at this maneuver and be booted from the program. Well, Lior takes him, and before they get in the tank, Lior kind of walks him up to the tank and he stops at this model of the battlefield. It's like a tabletop about yay high. And he stops him and he says, Gabi, now, what are you going to do when we get to this part of the terrain? And Gabi goes, well, I think I kind of know. I'll probably do this and I'll navigate here and there. Now, what about if the enemy comes at you from this angle? What are you going to do? What about if the enemy is firing from over here? What will you do? And so Gabi and Lior take a few minutes to kind of prep. They get into the tank, and not only does Gabi perform that maneuver well, he performs the maneuver perfectly, which incidentally was the toughest maneuver in the entire test suite. A maneuver where all conditions change, nothing can be predicted, it's nothing but ambiguity and on-the-fly kinds of decisions. They get done, they come down from the tank, Lior turns to him and he says, Gabi, you are not dismissed. He stays in the program, graduates in the top 10%, goes on to officer training, graduates again in the 10%, and is asked to become a ganon, which is a Hebrew term for an officer that cultivates the talent of other officers. When Gabi told me this story and shared this experience with me, it reminded me of something we all know to be true, that is often within change of command comes a change in capability. We can be smart and capable and at our best around some leaders, but yet other leaders can cause us to doubt ourselves and to hold back, and in Gabi's case, be stupefied with fear.